Kalhalal Yahal Bashim Shai Bashim Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles of Great Millstone. Peace and salutations to all the Yakim, all the bishops, all the elders pushing the gospel out in truth and sincerity. I'm going to read Apostle Gabar mentioned this book last week. It's called Vultures in Eagle's Clothing. So I'm going to read through it and see what scriptures come out, and I'll bring the scriptures as they come to me. This is more just a read through an audiobook, an audible type audiobook of Vultures in Eagle's Clothing with slight interruptions. Can you call it interruptions? Slight interjections where I'll talk of scriptures that come to my mind. So let's read through. I'll miss all of that. So it says, Professor of Law, University of California, Berkeley, School of Law. We can miss that. Michigan Journal of Race and Law. So, George Washington and George Washington's slaves lived different realities, and if we extend that insight to all the dimensions of white America, we will realize that blacks lived in a different time and a different reality in this country. And the terrifying implication of all this is that there is another time, another reality, another America. Introduction. On the day after tax day 1996, I read with fascination an article in the San Francisco Chronicle titled State Panel Probes Legislators' Reluctance to Pay Federal Taxes. The article reported that State Senator Don Rogers, Bakersfield Republican, was under investigation for his declaration 4 years ago that he did not have to pay federal taxes. The reason? Rogers claimed he held a white man's citizenship and was not a United States citizen. The article quoted from the affidavit Rogers had filed with the Sonoma County Recorder's Office in 1992, the same year. The article noted that he had filed for protection under the federal bankruptcy law after the Internal Revenue Service sought nearly $150,000 in back taxes, interests, and penalties. I, Donald A. Rogers, being of sound mind and lawful age, do solemnly declare I was born in Louisiana State of parents who were white, who were citizen principals, and whose parents' time out of mind were and always had been white. The main purpose of the Clause 1 of the 14th Amendment is establishing the citizenship of the Negroes. So he's arguing that the whole point of the amendment is nothing to do with him, it's to do with the Negroes. And as such a white man's citizenship was not restricted by the 14th Amendment, and because he receives no protections from it, he has no reciprocal obligation to a 14th Amendment allegiance or sovereignty, and owes no obedience to anyone under the 14th Amendment. The narrator has said, surfing the World Wide Web after reading this article, I found 5 different websites in one afternoon concerning the illegality of the tax system. So, Bron Bennett, The Challenge of the Blackness, 1972. Robert G. Gunnison, State Panel Probes Legislators' Reluctance to Pay Federal Taxes. These are just accounts of things that the researcher has come across which pertain to the clause which Donald A. Rogers is seeking. 14th Amendment. So, surfing the World Wide Web after reading this article, I found 5 different websites in one afternoon concerning the illegality of the tax system. each linking to 4 or 5 other sites, and most containing links to an email list for discussions. Nearly a decade later, although websites have moved in and out of existence and in and out of public accessibility, a similar search turned up similar results. Although many of these sites offer materials for sale, many more do not. Interspersed with the ads for books and videotapes promising immediate relief from taxes are many articles and essays written by non-lawyers or on constitutional matters and posted for discussion. Multiple copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are linked to these web pages. Even the material on these sites that seem to be primarily aimed at taking advantage of people's greed and gullibility taps into a conversation that transcends narrow economic interests. The conversation concerns the nature of America, of the American government and its relationship to the people whom it purports to represent. The people who create these sites are known by many names: patriots, citizens, militias, tax and anti-government protesters, white separatists, survivalists. They, especially immediately after the 1995 bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, are often portrayed as more numerous, better organized, and more powerful and menacing than they really are. They are commonly described in the popular press in terms of their distance from America, their political alienation, their ideological extremism, their social dissatisfaction. A subset of this broad, diverse, and fluid group, however, is notable not only for its distance from America, but also for its deep engagement with it. These people, whom I will call legal populists, understand themselves not as opposed to the nation, but as its disinherited scions. Scions. What is science? Let's look up that word, scions. Scions. Scions, a young shoot or twig of a plant. No. So a scion would be a descendant of a notable family. He was a scion of a wealthy family. So a descendant, an heir, and a successor. So let's go to these people, whom I will call legal populists, understand themselves not as opposed to the nation, but as its disinherited scions. The trouble they look forward to include the collapse of the United States government, yet they take the United States basic legal documents, the Declarations of Independence and the original Constitution, as sacred texts on par with the Christian Bible, which many also revere. So let me read this. Popular accounts seem both to exaggerate the threat these groups pose and to caricature their members. Popular accounts seem both to exaggerate the threat that these groups pose and to caricature their members. Richard Mitchell, for example, emphasizes low turnouts and poor organization among the survivalists he visited and got to know in the course of researching his book, Dancing at Armageddon. And he harshly criticizes journalists and fellow academics for saving the Aryan cause and its like from its own triviality by creating a mediagenic but false story of well-oiled machineries of violent racist terror. See Richard Mitchell, Dancing at Armageddon, Survivalism at Chaos in Modern Times, page 173 to 74, 2002. Describing the media and academic fascination with Aryanism and concluding there is nothing grand about practiced Arianism, including Nothing Grandly Sinister, Betty Dobrats, and Stephanie Shanks Mayle, who studied white separatists. Note the many factions these groups are split into, and wonder whether they ought even to be considered a single movement. Betty A. Dobrats, and again Stephanie Shanks Mayle. The White Separatists movement in the United States, White Power, 13, 1997. They also quote George Eric Hawthorne of the Resistance Record Company, a white power label, as musing. I always find it, I'm trying to look for the right word, perhaps perplexing that a movement that is really so relatively small, so relatively insignificant in comparison to the power structure, can get so much media attention. That sounds familiar. That sounds like GMS. Let's read that again. This person states, I believe this is George Eric Hawthorne. I always find it, I'm trying to look for the right word, perhaps perplexing, that a movement that is really so relatively small, so relatively insignificant in comparison to the power structure, can get so much media attention. Well, the Lord said that He chooses the lowly of this world to confound the wise of this world. So let's continue. ID at 86, Kathleen Blee observes that news media typically depict racist activists as semi-articulate, yes, lower class men and sometimes women who spew venomous sentiments about African Americans, Jews and immigrants, but notes that actual recruitment patterns do not fit these stereotypes. Kathleen M. Blee, Inside Organized Racism, Women in the Hate Movement, 25th of, Women in the Hate Movement 25, written in 2002. So continuing, they take the United States basic legal documents, the Declaration of Independence and the original Constitution, as sacred texts on par with the Christian Bible, which many also revere. The people in whom I am interested are, in fact, conducting a romance with the law, its forms, its tools, its expressive and material power. Legal populists are not likely to identify with traditionally subordinated identity groups, but they do view themselves as disenfranchised, and as traditionally subordinated groups have often done in the United States, they look to the law both as a site of oppression and as a potential source of redemption. The article has three interrelated aims. First, I will briefly describe the online world of the legal populists. Other legal scholars have provided detailed and insignificant and insightful, even brilliant glimpses of the legal worlds these groups inhabit. However, like the popular press, they have tended to emphasize the distance of those worlds from ours. The adjectives applied to the legal populists and their activists by these scholars do this work vividly. So they'll use words such as terrifying, madness, frivolous, inane. For me, however, the most interesting thing about the legal populists is not their distance from the legal and political mainstream, but the intricate ways they like the subordinated identity groups with whom I identify, who are both their antithesis, and their cousins in struggle, at once reject and embrace it. My second aim in this article is to give an account of legal populism that connects it with the American tradition of conspiracy theory and with the political consciousness of survivalism, to the extent that the interpretive practices of legal populists approach the vertiginous, let's look at that word, extremely high or steep, extremely high or steep. So my second aim in this article is to give an account of legal populism that connects it with the American tradition of conspiracy theory and with the political consciousness of survivalism, to the extent that the interpretive practices of legal populists approach the vertiginous interpretive practices of conspiracy theory, so the steep practices of conspiracy theory. Legal populism, as Mark Fenster writes of conspiracy theory, represents the desire for and the possibility of a noble political order, yet in its disturbing revelations and uncertain resolution, it also implicitly recognizes the difficulty of achieving transparent, equitable power relations in a capitalist democracy. Moreover, law, I will suggest, is attractive to legal populists because learning to research and interpret Supreme Court opinions and file liens, like building your own bomb shelter or learning to live off of the grid, offers the possibility of a mastery over the conditions of one's life that is rarely possible in contemporary mass society. My third and final aim in this article is to examine, as David Williams has done in a wonderful series of articles, the relationship between the nation dreamed of by my legal populists and the one inhibited by state-sanctioned legal insiders. As Williams has convincingly shown, many legal populists seek the restoration of a white Republican America that is utterly incompatible with the multinational, multicultural America of the 21st century. Legal populism's nostalgia resonates with the hopes of many elites whose conservative political agenda similarly targets both the federal government and unassimilable minorities as enemies of the nation. Yet, unlike these elites, the legal populists feel themselves to be disenfranchised and disempowered, and their narratives reject rather than embrace current distributions of political power. So it sounds like these legal populists, they are of the elite, but they are not of the elite. So let's continue. Legal populists occupy a peculiar position in the nation that I think of as marginalized, but not subordinated. So they're marginalized, but so it's basically this is basically Esau against Esau, really. They desire the destruction of most existing legal, political, and social regimes of power, but they do so in the name of a utopian vision that is utterly true to aspects of American history that most Americans would rather simply forget. A look at the legal populists' world then shows not only its distance from, but also its nearness to our own. Let's read some of these. Name. So these are just some of the books pertaining to racial conspiracy theory, apparently. We can continue. Legal populism described. Akil Amar, a legal scholar and student. Akil Amar, a legal scholar and student of the United States Constitution, notes that the idea of popular education resurfaces over and over in the Bill of Rights. We are familiar, he says, with the checks and balances that form the structure of the original Constitution. National power was to be checked and balanced by state power, judicial, executive, and legislative power were to be separated and put in competition with one another. But we tend to neglect the framers' assumption. We tend to neglect the framers' assumption that the government itself was to be checked by the people. Amar argues that each intermediate association, the Bill of Rights, safeguards the church, the militia, and the jury. So, 1999, Hereinafter, Williams' Constitutional Tales of Violence. David C. Williams, The Militia Movement and Second Amendment Revolution. Conjuring with the People, 81, Cornell, L. REF, Rev. 879, 1996. Hereinafter, Williams, The Militia Movement. 9. Williams, Civic Republicanism, Supra, Note 5, Williams' Constitutional Tales of Violence. So these are just some books which might be of interest pertaining to legal populism. So the militia movement, the Bill of Rights as a constitution. So, for example, Amar notes that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson believed that professional judges had to be counterbalanced by citizen juries. ID at 1207 in addition. Both Madison and Jefferson emphasized public education about constitutional rights as the remedy for and deterrent to unconstitutional conduct. ID at 1208. Patrick Henry and John Marshall in the Virginia Ratifying Convention stressed the importance of maxims that ordinary people in a democracy would know and use to regulate their conduct. ID at 1208-09. Amar quotes from the Anti-Federalist Papers. If a nation means its systems, religious or political, shall have duration, it ought to recognize the leading principles of them in the front page of every family book. What is the usefulness of a truth in theory unless it exists constantly in the minds of the people and their assent? Just continue. So, minds of our own. A look at the legal populist's world then shows not only its distance from, but also its nearness to our own. Let's just continue reading from here. Was understood as a device for education. Michigan Journal of Race and Law was understood as a device for educating ordinary citizens about their rights and duties. The erosions of these institutions over the last 200 years has created a vacuum at the center of our Constitution. Let's read that again. The erosion of these institutions over the last 200 years has created a vacuum at the center of our Constitution. Thus, one of the main tasks for today's constitutional theorists should be to explore ways this vacuum might be filled. A Mars vacuum is being filled, but not by professional constitutional theorists communicating with readers from the general public. Rather, it is being filled by legal populism. Everyday people reading and interpreting the Constitution and federal cases and examining the basic elements of constitutional structure for themselves. For the purpose of this article, legal populism encompasses the following features: a patriotic interest in and affiliation with the primary legal texts of the United States, including the English common law, the Declaration of Independence and/or the original Constitution and Bill of Rights, a deep suspicion bordering on hatred of the United States government, which is often allied with a fear of internationalist New World Order, an engagement bordering on romance with the techniques of law, legal argument, legal research, and legal interpretation, and participation in a dialogue with others about these shared interests and commitments. Although much legal populist discourse takes place offline in workshops and seminars and through books available for purchase, I have focused on 3 documents available online. In real space, legal populism emerges from several distinct regions of the United States, whereas many of the for-profit seminars on tax avoidance are centered in the Midwest, for instance. The far West is the geographic ground zero of constitutional study by laypersons. So let's look at this. Series of notions impressed upon the minds of the people by examples, precepts, and declarations. ID at 1208 341. Citing 2. The Complete Anti-Federalists 382 to 842. Herbert Storin and Maria Dry. See also, for the people what the Constitution already says about your rights. I would therefore not include within legal populism those whose appeals to the legal system seem prompted more by mental illness than political protest. Some conspiracy theorists seem to be engaged in a solidarity effort, so they're on their own, single vision, solitary effort, solitary, so that means singular or alone, effort to battle internal personal demons rather than collective culture. For example, in Tyler v. Carter 151 ERD 537 SDNY 1993, Affidavit 41 F.3D 1500, so 1994, a federal district court dismissed the claim of one Terry Smith Tyler, who had sued former President Jimmy Carter, then President William Clinton. Ross Perot, American Cyanamid, Iron Mountain Security Corporation, the Defense Intelligence Agency, IBM, David Rockefeller, Rockefeller Fund, BCCI, and NASA. Miss Tyler, representing herself, filed a federal complaint in December 1992 alleging what the court called a bizarre conspiracy involving the defendants to enslave and oppress certain segments of our society. Well, she wasn't wrong. Tyler's understanding of this conspiracy, however, was internally generated. Plaintiff contends she is a cyborg and that she received most of the information which formed the basis of her complaint through a protus. Let's look up that word. Protus. It says Protus in Greek mythology, the prophetic old man of the sea and shepherd of the sea of flocks. So Protus comes from prophetic, I'm guessing. Yes. It's not exactly clear. So Tyler's understanding of this conspiracy, however, was internally generated. Contends she is a cyborg and that she received most of the information which formed the basis of her complaint through Proteus, which the court read to be some silent telepathic form of communication. So yeah, it does come from the word prophetic, which read to be some silent telepathic form of communication. Well, that is a thing. That is a thing. It's called. I mean, many of the brothers in the body of GMS and just Israel will receive a lot of Proteus information through the spirit. So it might be through visions, it might be through things similar to deja vu, could be through dreams. So let's continue. So Vultures in Eagle's Clothing, article published in 1995 in the journal Government Executive Declared Constitutional Interpretation, the newest hobby in the rural West. Constitutional interpretation, the newest hobby in the rural West. In cyberspace, however, legal populism forms a single, many-layered subaltern counterpublic, a public world within a world, distinct both from the formal world of state politics and from the civic life of the general public. Legal populism is closely connected with what its participants sometimes call the Patriot movement. One writer describes the Patriot movement this way. The Patriot movement is an American political ideology based on an ultra-nationalistic and selective populism which seeks to return the nation to its constitutional roots. That is, a system based on white Christian male rule. Its core myth is that such a reactionary revolution will bring about a great national rebirth, ending years of encroaching moral and political decadence wrought by a gigantic world conspiracy of probably satanic origins. So this person's interpretation of the Patriot movement is, again, it's what the Bible describes as Satan divided against Satan. If Satan be divided against Satan, how can it stand? And this also goes into because what this person is basically What this person is basically talking about is higher powers and them being left out. So let's get that scripture, because it is linked. There is a scripture for this. His name, So that would be, yeah. So that's Jeremiah 49:10. It says, "But I have made Esau bare. I have uncovered his secret places, and he shall not be able to hide himself. His seed is spoiled, and his brethren and his neighbors, and he is not." So this person talking about the patriot movement and uh, encroaching moral and political decadence wrought by a gigantic world conspiracy of probably satanic origins. Well, yes, they're not far off, because the elites do garner much of their power through the left-hand side. So we battle not against flesh and blood. The scriptures say we battle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and spirits found in high places. So yes, these powers do garner a lot of their strength through satanic origins. And like it says, Esau, the chief of the Edomites, the chief of the Idumeans, would be Amalek today. They would be the people calling themselves Jewish. They reside in Israel today. And they have much of the power over the media, over the TV, the movies, and many other Western Edomites. They're not involved in that. They're not. They weren't written into the inheritance. Amalek has not written them into the inheritance of that. Although some of them may enjoy some of the benefits that Amalek does dish down. They do dish that down. So the likes of Tony Blair, the Bushes, if you play ball, they'll play ball with you. Sometimes, maybe, kind of. Anyway, so let's read on. Central to the patriot movement is a deep engagement and familiarity with legal texts. Indeed, Amar's work suggests that the legal populists would have been smiled on by the founding fathers. They are carrying on the tradition of a citizenry that is not passive but instead actively educated in its rights. A citizenry that takes the Constitution and constitutional questions very seriously, as a matter of day-to-day life, and not just something one learns in school at a legal and philosophical as I continue. At a legal and philosophical level. At a legal and philosophical level. Moreover, they carry on the debates that emerged around the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, and the subsequent debates that emerged around the time of the first Reconstruction. Indeed, because these debates have never been settled even within the mainstream of jurisprudential thought, jurisprudential, let's look up that word, jurisprudential. The theory of philosophy of law. So the theory of American jurisprudence. In simple words, it can be said that jurisprudence is the name given to a certain type of investigation into law, an investigation of abstract, general, and theoretical nature, which tried to find essential principles of law and legal systems. Okay, so jurisprudential thought. So it's not set in stone, it's more of a theoretical research into the thoughts of law. These groups are engaged in an ongoing conversation in American society about a matter that everyone in the conversation agrees to be important, even fundamental. How shall we, the people, constitute ourselves? Ironically, however, the very seriousness with which these groups engage in the debate also makes them a threat to the existing social order, particularly the federal government, an institution which these groups treat as more or less illegitimate. In patriot circles, the federal government is often referred to as ZOG, that's it, Z-O-G, ZOG, which stands for Zionist Occupied Occupation. So Zionist Occupied Government, or Zionist Occupation Government. So this is how these patriots see the Amalek, really, the people over there in Israel, the Zionists, the one pulling the strings, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Gettys, you know. This is how they call them, ZOG, Zionist Occupied Government, which is funny because the ZOG called them Goy, which means cattle, Goyim. That's what they call them in Yiddish, that's cattle. So patriots call them ZOG, ZOG called them, or the elites called them Goy. So government and the federal government, including but not limited to the IRS. So the IRS is even called the ZOG. Has a similar level of respect for them. The places, but not limited to the IRS, has a similar. So let's read that again. In patriot circles, the federal government is often referred to as ZOG, which stands for Zionist Occupied Government, and the federal government, including but not limited to the IRS. So they call the federal government ZOG, they call the IRS ZOG. The places where the legal populists come into contact with the mainstream legal system, then rather than being places where edifying debates shape for merely passive non-voters into thoughtful and caring civic Republicans, are places fraught with tension, if not open conflict. So the Bible does speak about this, a time of Jacob's trouble, but this is not just directed at Jacob. It's neighbor against neighbor. It's family against family. There's a lot of factions of fighting, which is prophesied, and you're kind of seeing this whole Satan divided against Satan when you're seeing these patriots which are feeling left out. You know, a lot of the elite, you know, they packed their suitcase, stuffed it with money, and jetted over to New Zealand and other places, and just left them high and dry. You know, these people that you see on Fox and CNN, these types, you know, Tyler Tucker, those kind of types, just left them high and dry, packed their suitcase and fled. And just watched the dollar lower from a distance. So let's continue. After the Revolutionary War, European scholars noted that Americans were not only highly literate, but very knowledgeable about the law as well. Part of the reason for the legal literacy of those Americans is attributable to that magnificent work, Sir William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, which was a bestseller in the colonies. But the circumstances of Americans have changed over the last 200 years, and Today, too many lack a working knowledge of the law, and especially of freedom law. The purpose of this site is to assist those who seek legal tools for the battle to restore liberty and freedom to this country, which we know obviously through the scriptures is not possible. The whole build back better thing is not possible. The Lord says they will build, but I will throw down. Edom will build and to restore the. Let's get it. I think it's something to the effect of, although Edom will build. Yeah, it's Malachi 1:4. Whereas Edom saith, we are impoverished, but we will return and rebuild the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord have indignation forever. Okay, so the whole Build Back Better movement, I believe it's waning, but regardless of whether it is or not, that's the Lord's words are the Lord's words are set in stone, literally. So legal populism can be divided into at least 4 overlapping conversations about the law and its institutions. The first conversation is associated with money in general and taxes in particular, and concerns the legitimacy of the federal income tax. Economic institutions such as the Federal Reserve Bank and various international organizations such as the militia movement, specifically, and gun culture. More generally, and concerns the meaning of the Second Amendment, the structure and function of state and local militias, and the legitimacy of the federal government. The third conversation is associated with efforts, often illegal or extra-legal, to reconstitute or invent new legal sovereignties, often through defying or jamming existing legal institutions and actors. See? So let's read that again. The third conversation is associated with efforts, often illegal or extra-legal. Let's look at that term, extra-legal. What does that mean? Extra-legal. I've never heard of that. Beyond the province of the law, there was extra-legal means through which to render the NAACP impotent. So extra-legal basically is not governed or regulated by law. A system which is not governed or it's not recognized by law. So basically they're just doing what they want. The third conversation is associated with efforts, often illegal or extra-legal, to reconstitute or invent new legal sovereignties, often through defying or jamming existing legal institutions and actors. So let's look at a scripture for that. So it's Isaiah 10:1. Woe to them that decree unrighteous decrees, and which write grievousness that they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. So that is what that is describing. Jamming existing legal, institutions and using illegal, extra-legal means. So the fourth conversation is associated with the freeman or sovereign citizen movement and concerns the effort to redeem national citizenship. People may enter these unofficial legal conversations through one or more of these interests and for various reasons: greed and desire to make money, gullibility and or straitened economic circumstances, a radical disillusionment with the political economy of the United States and the world more generally, a commitment to white race pride and separatism, the desire to deeply engage with the legal documents that formed the United States, libertarian political views, the conviction that governments and corporations have too much money and power, or a desire to live in a world where political economy is actively being made, not passively received. In this article, my aim is not to provide a complete account of these worldviews, but only to highlight some of the complex ways legal populism simultaneously rejects and embraces official state law. The following sections provide a brief glimpse into the four worlds of legal populism just described. Taxes and money. The affidavit Senator Rogers filed emerges from, so Senator Rogers being the one at the beginning who stated that he did not have to pay £150,000 in interest and back taxes because he was white, and the Fourth Amendment didn't apply to him. So the affidavit Senator Rogers filed emerges from the convergence of at least two long, rich traditions in American life. Let's go back. Accidentally. What page is it? Bear with me while I find. So here it is. The affidavit Senator Rogers filed emerges from the convergence of at least two long, rich traditions in American life: tax protest and hucksterism. Let's look up hucksterism. One who sells wares or provisions in the streets. A person who employs showy methods to effect a sale, win votes, etc. The crass methods of political hucksters. So it's basically wiles. They're using wiles as in WILES, to win over their audience. The affidavit Senator Rogers filed emerges from the convergence of at least two long, rich traditions in American life: tax protest and hucksterism. The American addiction to get-rich schemes, including tax evasion schemes, needs no introduction. It is not surprising that people hoping to get rich themselves have used various legalistic arguments in books, tapes, and workshops to help people persuade the IRS that they do not actually have to pay taxes. Nor is it surprising that this industry is now accessible through the internet. Type the word taxes into any internet search engine, and you'll quickly tap into a series of sites that promise, if you simply give them your credit card number, that you can buy books or pamphlets or audio types with titles like IRS Under Indictment and Vultures in Eagle's Clothing. These materials explain how the Internal Revenue Service actually has no claim on you, which really they don't, according to the Bible, which America professes that it uses. Freedom from federal tax liability is only a few $100s away. Reliable estimates of the actual number of tax protesters and the amounts the federal government loses annually to tax evasion and fraud are hard to find. Anecdotal evidence of a thriving industry in tax scamming, however, is not so hard to find. As one example, the urban legend that the IRS permits African Americans to claim a reparations credit has circulated in various iterations for years, finding particularly fertile ground in black churches in the South and West, which, it shouldn't, so-called black people, so-called African Americans in America haven't been paid a dime for all of that work. Everyone just brushes it underneath the carpet. All these other groups which were affected in some kind of major way by actions by America and its government were reimbursed some way, whether it be the Japanese or Israel, even though America, I believe, played a major part in taking down the German government. Israel has its hand in America's pocket deeply. There's many reparations which people calling themselves Jewish today are receiving at the hands of the American government. So it's just funny when you look at it, when you look at the whole situation, but it's the curses pertaining to Deuteronomy 28. IRS permits African Americans to claim, look at that. The urban legend that the IRS permits African Americans to claim a reparations credit has circulated in various iterations for years, finding particularly fertile ground in black churches in the South and West. In January 2002, the IRS announced it has received nearly 80,000 returns for the previous tax year, claiming more than 2.7 billion in false reparations refunds. And it filed civil suits in United States federal district courts in Richmond, Virginia, and Jackson, Mississippi, against two tax preparers spreading this gospel. In the fall of the previous year, Florida law enforcement officials put a Miami-Dade mother and daughter team that had been promoting a similar scam out of business. Within the world of tax protest, a number of arguments, although repeatedly rejected by the courts, have become canonical in legal populist communities. A few of them follow. Estimates like 200 billion to 300 billion per year in lost federal revenue are sometimes thrown around. So see examples: taxpayer beware, schemes, scams and cons. Hearing before the Senate Committee on Finance 107th Congress 2-4 in 2001. Comments of Senator Max Baucus, DMT, and Senator Frank Murkowski, RAK. A more conservative estimate puts the tax gap. A more conservative estimate puts the tax gap, the difference between the amount of the tax owed to the government and the amount actually paid, at something over 127 billion annually. Pamela H. Busey, Criminal Tax Fraud, the Downfall of Murderers, Madams and Thieves. 29. Aritz, STLJ 639-239-1997. C. Laura Vazella, Man faces prison for tipping others to black tax credit. Community appeal. Memphis, Tennessee, June 20th, 1999. Jerry Sepper, Justice sues taxpayers over slavery refund quest. Washington Times, March 7th. And it's funny, wouldn't you think that, I don't know, someone with honor would say, do you know what, maybe, or at least cut them a break, but no. Justice sues taxpayers over slavery refund. So not only doesn't give them money, but actually turns around and sues them. Susan R. Miller, tax scam shut down. South Florida mother-daughter team told African-American clients they could get tax credits as reparations for slavery. Broward Daily Bus, Rev. October 3, 2001 at 8-9. See also IRS fact sheet. Reparation scams, carrier price, release note. These reparation scams are not necessarily directly related to tax fraud. A flyer advertising $5,000 reparation checks sent to people of black ethnic race born prior to 1928 encouraged elderly African Americans to supply their names, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, and dates of birth to an organization with a Washington, D.C. post office. So these people are getting these so-called African Americans, they're Israelites, to provide all their details, their national security, everything like that, and then they're finding out from the courts, look, you don't have a leg to stand on. There's no there's no refund and all this. But it's obvious that these people that have gotten their addresses and things of that nature, their details, are of course making money off of those details somehow. They're not just taking these details in a check. They're using those details. That's just my fault. My thoughts. I don't have any papers for that, but it's clear. DC Post Office box misleading mailings targeted to seniors. Hearing before the Subcommon. Darren Williams, Chief of Staff and Counsel, Office of the Arkansas ATI. Federal investigators tracking the organization down found no evidence of identity fraud, but did discover a database compiled for the purpose of further mailings. Yeah, sure, come on. Really? Does anyone believe that? Federal investigators tracking the organization down found no evidence of identity fraud, but did discover a database compiled for the purpose of further mailings. The scripture says, father of lies. He is the father of lies. So, Federal Reserve notes are not legal tender. Because the United States monetary system is no longer secured to the gold standard, as in the money is not related to gold, it's not backed by gold, it's just paper. So because the United States monetary system is no longer secured to the gold standard, this argument posits that Federal Reserve notes do not constitute actual money in themselves, but instead are mere promises to pay. One version of this claim is based on the Par Value Modification Act, Section 2, which established a new per par value of the dollar in terms of gold, such that 42 2/9 dollars would equal 1 fine troy ounce of gold. Citing to this statute, one federal defendant claimed that for tax purposes, his income should be calculated in terms of the market price of gold. Another more sweeping argument is that Federal Reserve notes, because they are not backed by gold, are not lawful tender within the meaning of Article 1.8 of the United States Constitution, which gives Congress the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, regulate the value. Let me go back up. 1 second. find. Which gives Congress the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. This argument is closely related to the argument that Article 110, Clause 1, no state shall coin money, emit bills of credit, make any things but gold and silver coin a tender in payments of debts, prohibits the state from utilizing any paper note or credit issued by any private banking institution, whether the same be Federal Reserve notes, bookkeeping entries of liability or otherwise. So this is the whole, let's get that scripture. So James 5:3, your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. See that? Because this money, this Federal Reserve, which was instituted in 1917, is slowly deteriorated and made the American people debt slaves. It's not backed by anything. The money is not backed by anything. And this is by design. This is because the people that sit at the very top of that pyramid, which you see on the American dollar, they're not affected by this because they know when to put the money in and they know when to pull the money out. And like I said, 2019, when a lot of this started kicking off, you'll find that a lot of money was made, and at the right time, a lot of that money was pulled out. So a lot of the people that were backing the American dollar, they fled, and remains to be seen if they choose to, I mean, it wouldn't matter anyway, even if they chose to invest back into the American dollar. The American dollar is trillions into debt. I believed that it was 30 trillion, but I do remember Apostle Tahar saying that it's more than 30 trillion. It's more, I believe he said more, that it was 200 trillion. So if that's anywhere near true, then it wouldn't matter whether they choose to invest in America again and, whatever they plan. It doesn't matter. The scriptures say, James 5:3, your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. So that dollar is crumbling. And as the dollar crumbles, obviously it affects all other currencies greatly. Wages are not income. The argument that wages are not income was widely circulated in the late 1970s and early 1980s, encouraged by popular books such as Are You Required by Bob Golden and Pete Sonlen, and Judicial Tyranny by Jeff Dickstein. The classic form of the argument draws on a Supreme Court decision that defined income as the gain derived from capital, from labor, or from both combined. If income means profit, then wages are arguably not income, because the exchange of labor for compensation is an even exchange, and thus creates no profit. Yeah, well, and the Bible does say that, and you're not supposed to hold wages as well. You're not supposed to hold wages 2 weeks, 30 days, however long it is. Let's see if we can. Let me see if I can get that scripture. I'm not sure where it is. Leviticus 19 and 13. Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night. Let me get that. So, Leviticus 19 and 13. Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. So, when you work, you're supposed to get paid that very same day. At the end of the day, you're supposed to receive your wages. There's not supposed to be a week's pay or 14 weeks pay or 30 days pay. That is ridiculous. And that is what people have accepted. But let's continue. An even exchange, and thus creates no profit. And that's what this is all about, profit. When your wages is held, those who are holding that money are amassing profit off of your money and then giving you the money which you've earned. But they've already amassed profit from it, you see. It's kind of like, let's say you have no claims. I've been through this. I've had a motorbike accident back in 2014, and I remember that was a very long-winded experience. So the money was there available, but what they do is they prolong or they might drip feed you the money. They might say, okay, well, here's like 1,000 here, or here's 1,000 there. They will not give you the full amount because they amass interest off of the money which is owed to you. So an insurance company might pay out, the other person's insurance company might pay out and give your lawyer or your solicitor money, but they won't release that information to you, and they will not grant you that money all at once. This is how they make their profit, despite also taking a cut of the money which is given to you. But an even exchange, and thus creates no profit. A variant, the argument is that wages are not income because they are derived from the taxpayer's person, which is a depreciable asset. So let's look at the 16th Amendment. A host of challenges are regularly asserted against the propriety of the 16th Amendment, which was ratified in 1913 and gave Congress the authority to impose income taxes without regard to apportionment. To prove that 16th Amendment was never in fact ratified, it must be shown that at least 3 states' ratifications were improper and void. In their efforts to do this, protesters have called attention to the existence of numerous procedural and clerical errors in the ratification process in several states. The ratification process in Oklahoma was particularly riddled with mistakes and lapses in procedural regularity, and so the argument that Oklahoma's ratifications were improper is a favorite of protesters. So, United States versus Davenport, 824 F.2D, 1511, 1520. Was written about in 1987. Lonsdale versus CIR, 661 F2D, 7172, 5th CIR, 1981. C. Coleman versus CIR. Who is CIR? I'm not. Let me look who that is. CIR. CIR. America. Okay, Commissioner of Internal Revenue. So it's a treasury position. So Coleman versus CIR 791 F.2D 6872. So that was 1986. Prior to 1913, federal tax revenues were derived from miscellaneous taxes imposed on a case-by-case basis. A tax imposed to pay for the Civil War expired under its own terms in 1872. Jackson supernotes. So a tax imposed to pay for Civil War expired under its own terms. Okay. A second income tax imposed in 1894 was held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision because it violated the apportionment clause. So there was some kind of moral back then, because look, a second income tax imposed in 1984 so that was held unconstitutional. Further up than that, a tax imposed a tax imposed to pay for the Civil War expired under its own terms in 1872. So that has moral code there. Just that has a moral code there. You can see the depreciation of moral code. And actually, they state that it happens in prior to 1913, which is interesting because 1914 is when the Balfour Declaration was signed, granting the people that are in Israel today jurisdiction over that land. It wasn't until around 1948 that they went in there, but just the fact that nations recognized that document in 1914 probably gave a lot of power, because 3 years after that they took over the federal bank. They created the Federal Reserve Bank. Many powerful figures flew over to Jekyll Island, secluded place, behind closed doors. They spoke about what they spoke about, and the Federal Reserve was born. So prior to 1913, federal tax revenues were derived from miscellaneous taxes imposed on a case-by-case basis. Again, some kind of moral code. You can see the depreciation. Case-by-case basis, not just a blanket. According to one commentator, the 1984 income tax represented a victory for citizens in the economically depressed South and West, who had asserted with increased intensity that the corporate barons of the East should be compelled to share the wealth resulting from the booming industrial economy. Jackson supernotes 6 at 299 in the air. So David Burnham, Law, Intent. So there's a paper written about that. Jackson supernotes 6, 305, 302. Tax protesters have also argued that Ohio was not a state admitted into the Union until 1953, and thus President William H. Taft of Ohio was not legally the President of the United States in 1913, making his appointment of Secretary of State Philander C. Knox, who verified that 16th Amendment was properly ratified. So let's read that again. Tax protesters have argued that Ohio was not a state admitted into the Union until 1953, and thus President William H. Taft of Ohio was not legally the President of the United States in 1913, making his appointment of Secretary of State Philander C. Knox, who verified that the 16th Amendment was properly ratified, null and void. Other arguments contend the Secretary of State Knox committed fraud when he certified the amendment as ratified, because he was aware of the differences between the congressional and state versions of the proposed 16th Amendment, and the Secretary of State's certification of the 16th Amendment was an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority and a violation of the constitutional separation of powers, ID at 306. So let's read two more pages. The tax system is unlawful because it violates individual constitutional rights. Many different provisions of the Constitution have unsuccessfully been invoked to support the conclusion that the tax system is unlawful because it violates individual constitutional rights. For example, filing tax returns is said to be prescribed by the Fifth Amendment as a form of self-incrimination, or to violate the constitutional right to privacy encompassed by the Ninth Amendment. Income taxes are said to constitute a taking of property with just compensation in violation of the Fifth Amendment, and the obligation to pay taxes is said to be a form of involuntary servitude, unconstitutional under the 13th Amendment. And that is what a lot of these documents are. Let's get a scripture for that. Job 20 and 12. And this is what Job thinks about this kind of, because Job is well aware of these kind of tactics, these wiles. It says, though wickedness be sweet in his mouth, though he hide it under his tongue. And that is what a lot of these declarations, a lot of these clauses, a lot of these amendments, they contradict each other, or there's like loopholes, or things of that nature. But that's not accidental. That's intentionally designed like that, so that when you find something which is beneficial to you, they can say, no, well, over here, this, conflicted with this because, you had done that, you went this way, you went left, you should have went right, you went right, you should have went left, and are they? That's how they speak, So, the wickedness be sweet in his mouth, though he hide it under his tongue. So, he might say, you missed the small print, or you've seen it in these adverts, they might say an advert which says, this pill might help you do this, whatever. And at the very end of the advert, they'll rush a whole mass of text across the screen, and someone will read the text, and then they will speed up the reading of the text. So it's not very clear. It's not legible, and it's not audible. Everything's like sped up very, very fast. And we're talking in the space of like maybe 3 seconds, a whole mass of information. But most people, they just hold on to the information which was said in the rest of the advert, the rest of the 30 seconds of the advert, or however long it was. So many different provisions of the Constitution have unsuccessfully been invoked to support the conclusion that the tax system is unlawful because it violates individual constitutional rights. For example, filing tax returns is said to be prescribed by the Fifth Amendment as a form of self-incrimination, or to violate the constitutional rights to privacy encompassed by the Ninth Amendment. Income taxes are said to constitute a taking of property without just compensation in violation of the Fifth Amendment. And the obligation to pay taxes is said to be a form of involuntary servitude, unconstitutional under the 13th Amendment. Paying income taxes is voluntary. Finally, it is often said to the tax protest literature, it is often said in the tax protest literature that the income tax is voluntary and therefore optional, as there is no statute that makes any American citizen liable to pay that income tax. The IRS response is that voluntariness refers to the fact that you are responsible for assessing your own tax liability, and it's not the same as having the option not to pay taxes. So they're staunchly against it. Let's read this little part here. See United States versus Buckner, 830, F2D 102, United States versus Malquist, there's another case. So these are cases where people have gone against the government, citing that income taxes were unconstitutional, which they are. Which is funny because in that same court, you have to swear on the Bible, but they do not uphold what the Bible says. You're not supposed to hold wages to the, past the end of the day. You're not supposed to pay jury over, I think it's called jury, which is like interest. You're not supposed to pay tax on your wages. Schiffer versus United States, Lonsdale versus Egger, United States versus Roberts, Beltran versus Cohen. So there's a lot of people that are, fighting against the state, but it's some time ago, and a lot of people they don't have that same fight. Some do. Some do. Thus, the online Freedom Law School promises a cash reward to anyone who can prove, among other things, that such a statute exists. £300,000 income tax reward offer. The online Freedom Law School. Freedom Law School will offer £100,000 to the first person who can demonstrate any of the below propositions. The winner can collect up to £300,000 if she or he can demonstrate all of the 3 propositions listed below. And even if they were to prove that, I'm sure that the powers that be would find a way to loophole that. They're just basically getting a heads up to anyone that was wise enough to find a chink in their armor. Show what statute written by the Congress of the United States requires me to file an income tax confession. So someone has said, show what statute written by the Congress of the United States requires me to file an income tax confession return and paying income tax. How can I file an income tax confession return without waiving my Fifth Amendment protected right to not give any information to the government that may be used to prosecute me? Prove that the 16th Amendment of the United States constitutes the amendment of the US Constitution, which, according to the IRS and modern American courts, permitted the income tax to exist, was lawfully added to the US Constitution. Assessing your own tax liability is not the same as having the option not to pay taxes. That is what the IRS have said. Each of these arguments appears repeatedly in a tax protest literature, sometimes dying down for a few years only to flourish again when a new purveyor of tax avoidance services discovers it. Each of these arguments has also appeared repeatedly and been repudiated in the courts. Courtrooms represent one front line where taxpayers and their vision of an alternative legal universe meet the official legal universe, and the results have not been happy. From a mainstream judicial perspective, tax protests are threatening because of the trouble their behavior creates for the judicial bureaucracy because their arguments are not just wrong, but deeply complexly wrong, requiring time and energy to refute. Because they refuse the authority of the judicial system, retrying arguments that have long since been rejected, filing papers that violate conventions of argumentation and citation, and seeking remedies that cannot be granted because their arguments are grounded in political convictions that have long since been consigned to the dustbin of history, or that are repugnant to most upper middle class liberal professionals because their interpretive logic follows the rules of conspiracy theorizing, and perhaps because their foregoing skepticism reveals to a discomforting degree the conventional roots of legal institutions and legal practices. So that last paragraph just spoke of upper middle class people being, frustrated by it and repulsed by that kind of fight against the status quo, which is interesting because now they're finding themselves in a bit of a pickle where their livelihood is being threatened if they do not under strict if they do not follow what the government says to the T, their livelihood is being threatened. And that last episode, the last 2 years, that last episode, that was just a prelude. That was just a test. The real test is when they choose to go full bore and implement the microchip, the chip, which you're seeing in Sweden today. When America plans to do this, this is when a lot of things will take place. A lot of things are going to follow from that declaration. But it's just funny when you read documents like this. A lot of people say these people are conspiracy theorists, going against the status quo. They're just, they're just poor. They're just trying to find a come up. They're just trying to find well, what just happened over the last 2 years? What do you think that was about? Because I can't remember his first name, but Russo, something Russo. Let me see if I can find it. Russo. I can't remember his name. Anthony Russo or Joe Russo. Can't remember his name. Let me see if I can. Aaron Russo, because Aaron Russo previously said that he had a conversation with one of the Rockefellers who basically told him that, look, what we basically want to do is we want to have everyone basically take a radio frequency identification chip, and all their medical matters, their financial matters will be on that chip. So what I'm reading here, all of this going against the courts and taking time from the courts, and because the court's having to refute it, and that won't exist. Aaron Russo said that if they require money of you, they will just take it out of your chip. If you're a threat to the system or you're bothersome to the system, they'll just turn the chip off. That is what he said. That is what he said. One of the Rockefellers said to him. And Rockefellers are obviously one of the richest families, the founding members, one of the members that would have went over there to Jekyll Island in 1914 to found to birth the Federal Reserve. So Let's read on. Emblematic of these protesters might be Eugene M. Patsy Lonsdale, who throughout the 1980s tirelessly pressed their claims about the invalidity of the tax system, in both the Fifth and the 10th Circuit Courts of Appeals. In Lonsdale versus United States, for example, the Lonsdales filed what they described as a quiet title action against the federal government, seeking to prevent Internal Revenue Service levies for unpaid income taxes on their wages and on a credit union account. Upholding the district court's decision that their request was barred by an Anti-Injunction Act, the 10th Circuit recounted, the bulk of the Lonsdales' suit constitutes a refrain about the federal government's powers to tax wages or to tax individuals at all, which the Lonsdales have been pursuing for at least 14 years. After exercising considerable patience and tolerance, the Seventh Circuit upheld the district court's action, describing these 5 defenses as tired and, when raised in civil litigation, as in Judge Eastbrook's words, sanction bait. So, yeah, a lot of these files, they don't end up in the defendant's favor. You know what they say: the house always wins. So this is a big game that they play, and all while making the claimants swear on the Bible. When you enter a courtroom, you've got to swear on their Bible, but they do not uphold the laws of the Bible spoken of in Leviticus. So I'm going to leave that there, and I'll continue from there where I've left off next time. But it's an interesting book. It's an interesting read. Thank you, Apostle Gabar, for the shout out of this book. Finding it interesting, and looking forward to reading through it. So, shalom to all the Akim, the elders, the bishops, and of course the apostles of Great Millstone. Shalom.